probably heard the quote, "Those who forget the past are doomed to repeat it." In our lesson today, we are going to be getting an example of that quote. Thanks for coming back and joining me. I'm Kathy Brasby, and I'll be your teacher today. Daniel 5 picks up our series of stories about Daniel, who is really a Judean refugee who has been exiled or taken to the great nation of Babylon. So let's start with Daniel 5, verse 1. Many years ago, King Belshazzar gave a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles, and he drank wine with them. When Belshazzar was drinking the wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver cups that his predecessor, Nebuchadnezzar, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem. He wanted to drink from them with his nobles, his wives, and his concubines. We are meeting now a new king, Belshazzar, and we don't know very much about him. History tells us he probably was not the son of Nebuchadnezzar, a nephew or a cousin, but definitely a relative of Nebuchadnezzar. Now we see that he's now king, and he gives a huge party for 1,000 of his nobles. So they're all at this huge party drinking wine. He probably was sitting up on a platform. If you've ever seen some of those movies about ancient kings, often they're up on a platform, so they sit above the crowd, and they can see what's going on. Everybody is probably drinking. Keep in mind that this story picks up several years after Nebuchadnezzar's reign. However, in the book of Daniel, it immediately follows the story about Nebuchadnezzar being humbled and spending time out in the wilderness eating like an animal, where he comes to the place of recognizing that it is his pride that has brought on this judgment, and now he acknowledges the Most High God is a true God. Immediately following that story, as we roll into chapter 5, here we meet another king, another proud king. We see at this party, Belshazzar is drinking wine, and he had the gold and silver cups from the temple brought in. Belshazzar has the gold and silver cups that had been taken by Nebuchadnezzar out of the temple in Jerusalem when Nebuchadnezzar conquered Judah. Traditionally, when a king in those days would conquer, they would take a lot of the items out of the temple of the god of the country that was conquered. And they would take those items, put them in the temple of their god. It was one more symbol that showed how they had defeated this nation and their God had defeated this nation's God. It was a lot of symbolism there. Once these items from the conquered temple were placed in the new temple, the king had nothing to do with them. It was understood that those belonged to the God of that temple. That gives us a backdrop to what Belshazzar is doing. So in Daniel 5:3, so they brought these gold cups taken from the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines drank wine from them. While they drank from them, they praised their idols made of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. The king had no right to what was taken from one temple and placed in another. This alone would have offended even pagans of the day. It does make us wonder, why would he do this? Was it a propaganda trick? In other words, was he showing that he was greater than Nebuchadnezzar, who had won them in battle, whereas he could simply go into the temple and take them? Was it to challenge this defeated God? He would have expected the wrath of the deity who presided in that temple where the items were taken. That deity, by those standards, would have been angry to have those items taken away from them. So he would have expected there would be some repercussions from this. Obviously, Belshazzar didn't realize what deity he had really offended. And he obviously didn't take seriously what had happened during Nebuchadnezzar's reign. The defeat of Israel's God was ancient history, it looks like, to Belshazzar. Keep in mind that the book of Daniel was written to Israelites. So as they're hearing and reading these stories, they will bring an understanding to them that we don't always fully know yet, but we can dig in a little bit. For the Israelites, these vessels that had been taken to this foreign temple were vessels of hope, because they believed that at some point they would be allowed to return to their homeland, and they trusted they would take these vessels back to Jerusalem, rebuild the temple. This was the hope that many of them carried during this time. Those vessels told the Israelites that God still remembered his people and would restore them. There is a lot of hope in that. Now, Belshazzar, on the other hand, didn't care. We can see that clearly by these actions, which are astonishing that he would pull a stunt like this. But as these partiers, the nobles, the king, the wives, the concubines, are at this big party drinking, we assume, a great deal of drunkenness. Doesn't say that, but we can perhaps assume that. Suddenly, I'm looking at verse 5 now, suddenly they saw the fingers of a human hand writing on the plaster wall of the king's palace near the lampstand. The king himself saw the hand as it wrote, and his face turned pale with fright. His knees knocked together in fear, and his legs gave way beneath him. We wonder, what do those fingers look like? It's not something that we have in our database today. What fingers appearing on writing on a wall? The Israelites would understand because they would go back to their own holy scriptures. And the very first use of that phrase, finger of God, appears in Exodus 8:19. The context is that Moses is standing before Pharaoh. He has asked for the release of God's people, the Israelites, and now he has already called down 2 plagues on the Egyptians. And the third plague, which is the plague of gnats, is the first time that Pharaoh's magicians are not able to duplicate by probably illusions or maybe some kind of a magic trick. This particular plague they are not able to duplicate, and they say to Pharaoh, "This is the finger of God." So that phrase, finger of God, would resonate with the Israelites hearing about fingers even on a wall. Where we say, wow, that sounds really spooky, they would say, oh, God has entered the scene when they are told about the fingers. A second use of fingers in earlier Jewish scriptures is when the Israelites camped at Mount Sinai, and the finger of God inscribed the tablets with the law. So again, the Israelites would look at that and say, oh, finger of God. They would make that connection. When Belshazzar used these vessels just for drinking and partying, the owner of these vessels, God, showed up on the scene. We see first the finger of God, and we are reminded because of these Old Testament references the power of God and how he intervenes for his people. I want you to notice too the response of the king himself. Belshazzar's response would have been humorous to these Israelites who were hearing or reading this story. Remember, Belshazzar, the king of this great empire, came undone. His face turned pale, his terrified thoughts, his legs became weak, his knees are knocking, he could barely stand. Can you imagine how the Israelites would have howled at the image of this powerful king reduced to just a shaking mess by the hand of God? They would have seen all these connections, and they would have enjoyed seeing them. So then, verse 7, the king shouted for the enchanters, astrologers, and fortune tellers to be brought before him. He said to those wise men of Babylon, whoever can read this writing and tell me what it means will be dressed in purple robes of royal honor, and will have a gold chain placed around his neck. He will become the third highest ruler in the kingdom. Our king is desperate for an interpretation. He offers incredible rewards for this. So he shouts for his interpreters, and he offers them all the trappings of royalty and wealth and favor. Big rewards from the king. But verse 8, but when all the king's wise men had come in, none of them could read the writing or tell him what it meant. So the king grew even more alarmed, and his face turned pale. His nobles, too, were shaken. At this point, our Israelite readers are laughing at this powerful royal advisors and the king, and they are shaken by this. To make it worse, the wise men couldn't read it, they couldn't interpret it. It's possible, this is only a hypothesis, that it was written in Aramaic. Aramaic has no vowels, and if you don't know how to read Aramaic, it might look like nonsense to you. So, that's a possibility, but we don't know that for sure. Verse 10, but when the queen mother heard what was happening, she hurried to the banquet hall. She said to Belshazzar, "Long live the king. Don't be so pale and frightened." The queen mother had a pretty high position in the palace. It didn't mean that she was Belshazzar's mother exactly, but possibly she was. But she was very important, and she had some authority over the king. So she says to him, "Your panic is unnecessary. There is someone else who can help you." Now, keep in mind, she may have some connection back to Nebuchadnezzar's earlier reign. She knows about Daniel, and she's about to tell him. So, verse 11. There is a man in your kingdom who has within him the spirit of the holy gods. During Nebuchadnezzar's reign, this man was found to have insight, understanding, and wisdom like that of the gods. Your predecessor, the king, your predecessor, King Nebuchadnezzar, made him chief over all the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and fortune tellers of Babylon. This man, Daniel, whom the king named Belshazzar, has exceptional ability and is filled with divine knowledge and understanding. He can interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve difficult problems. Call for Daniel, and he will tell you what the writing means. So we see that our Queen Mother describes Daniel. She misunderstands something about Daniel as she says that he has the spirit of the gods. She didn't recognize where Daniel's spirituality came from, and it was coming, as we know, from a belief in the one true God. But she recognizes he has insights, understanding, wisdom, and that Nebuchadnezzar had made him chief over all the advisors. So she explains he can interpret dreams. He can give you advice. He can explain riddles. He can solve difficult problems. Give Daniel a call. There may be a little sarcasm in this for her, because it may be, if you are worthy of sitting on the throne, you should know this. How is it you don't know this? But Daniel is a reminder of the powerful and successful reign of Nebuchadnezzar. And it is possible that Belshazzar has appointed his own advisors and enchanters and magicians, and he has just sent Daniel off because Daniel reminds him of Nebuchadnezzar. So let's continue with our story. Verse 13. So Daniel was brought in before the king. The king asked him, "Are you Daniel, one of the exiles brought from Judah by my predecessor, King Nebuchadnezzar? I have heard that you have the spirit of the gods within you, and that you are filled with insight, understanding, and wisdom." Now notice how he starts. Belshazzar says to Daniel, "Are you one of the exiles brought in from Judah?" He doesn't say, Are you the man that was made in charge of this whole province? Are you the man that Nebuchadnezzar honored and got advice from? He didn't say any of those things. He identified Daniel as an exile brought from Judah, really diminishing who Daniel was. You're really just a Jewish slave. We can also suspect that for Belshazzar, Daniel was a symbol of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, and that Belshazzar would prefer to promote his own reign rather than that of predecessors. And so Daniel, in a sense, is in the same category as these temple vessels. They were all plunder from Jerusalem brought in by Nebuchadnezzar. And Belshazzar does not seem like he wants to connect with that prior generation, what happened, what Nebuchadnezzar achieved, and what he learned. So let's take a look at verse 15. My wise men and enchanters have tried to read the words on the wall and tell me their meaning, but they cannot do it. I am told that you can give interpretation and solve difficult problems. If you can read these words and tell me their meaning, you will be clothed in purple robes of royal honor, and you will have a gold chain placed around your neck. You will become the third highest ruler in the kingdom. I want you to notice he says, my wise men and enchanters couldn't read the words. That tells us again that these were not a part of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. They were a part of Belshazzar's reign. However, they couldn't do it either. So Belshazzar, in fairness, does offer Daniel a great reward like he offered to the other enchanters and magicians and interpreters. But he closes it out with yet another mild insult when he says, if you can read these words and tell me the meaning. So he's issuing a challenge to Daniel. I don't know if you can do it either. But let's move on. Daniel 17. Daniel answered the king, keep your gifts, or give them to someone else, but I will tell you what the writing means. Daniel declines these rewards. It looks like he has very little time for this king and his influence. I'm done with you. Now keep in mind, by now, we look historically, Daniel is no longer a young man. He is probably at least middle age or older. So he has seen a lot of things in the king's court. He has very little time for this king. So, verse 18, Daniel goes on, Your Majesty, the Most High God gave sovereignty, majesty, glory, and honor to your predecessor, King Nebuchadnezzar. So before even discussing what was written on the wall, Daniel reviews the reign of Nebuchadnezzar again and reviews what God gave him. Now it was sovereignty, majesty, glory, and honor. And he's really saying to Belshazzar, Nebuchadnezzar was a great king because God made him so. So that's the first message. So verse 19, Daniel continues, He made him so great that people of all races and nations and languages trembled before him in fear. He killed those he wanted to kill and spared those he wanted to spare. He honored those he wanted to honor and disgraced those he wanted to disgrace. We're seeing some of Nebuchadnezzar's reign of terror. He killed who he wanted to kill. He spared who he wanted to spare. So he was a powerful king and far from a perfect one. And we know that some from earlier in his reign. But verse 20, we continue. But when his heart and mind were puffed up with arrogance, he was brought down from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. We know that from chapter 4. We saw that arrogance. We saw Nebuchadnezzar surveying his great city and taking all the credit for it. Then we saw how God humbled him. We've seen that story. Daniel is kind of using shorthand here to remind Belshazzar, who should have heard of this story, should know something about it. Daniel continues. He was driven from human society. He was given the mind of a wild animal, and he lived among the wild donkeys. He ate grass like a cow, and he was drenched with the dew of heaven, until he learned that the Most High God rules over the kingdoms of the world and appoints anyone he desires to rule over them. Again, we see Daniel reviewing the story about Nebuchadnezzar and his being humbled by God, and the lessons that Nebuchadnezzar could learn, the lessons that Daniel certainly had observed about the power of God. Here we have in this great hall Belshazzar drinking from these vessels of gold and silver taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem. Belshazzar assumed that this God had no power in his kingdom. So now Daniel is opening that door and saying God has power throughout the world. So in verse 22 we read, "You are his successor, Belshazzar, and you knew all this, yet you have not humbled yourself." Wow. Daniel just drives his point home. Belshazzar has learned nothing from history. Remember our quote at the beginning? Belshazzar's guilty of that. Instead, Daniel continues in verse 23, "For you have proudly defied the Lord of heaven and have taken these cups from his temple brought before you. You and your nobles and your wives and your concubines have been drinking wine from them while praising gods of silver, gold, bronze, iron, wood, and stone, gods that neither hear nor see nor know anything at all. But you have not honored the God who gives you the breath of life and controls your destiny." Strong words coming from Daniel. And he is saying to Belshazzar, you knew this story, you continue to defy the God of heaven and earth. How could you not learn from Nebuchadnezzar's humiliation? So we see in Belshazzar a king who thinks he can defy the God of heaven. He's very proud, maybe more proud even than Nebuchadnezzar, I'm not sure. He exalts himself over the true God. So Daniel, in this strongly worded confrontation with Belshazzar, contrasts Belshazzar with Nebuchadnezzar. And in essence, he says, Nebuchadnezzar had some right to be proud. He built an entire empire. You just inherited it. He was willing to be taught, to be humbled, to recognize truth, recognize God. You, what have you done anyway? I mean, we could almost say today, except for this story about Belshazzar, he's a blip in history. And this story, it does not exalt him in any way. We see that Belshazzar was blasphemous. He blasphemed the God of Israel. And he was proud to do it. Verse 24. So God has sent this hand to write this message. We get the confirmation. The Israelites hearing this story already suspected this. Daniel confirms it. This hand is from God. This is God's message. This is the message that was written. Mina, Tekel, Parson. This is what these words mean. Mina means numbered. God has numbered the days of your reign and has brought it to an end. Tekel means weighed. You have been weighed on the balances and have not measured up. Parson means divided. Your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. It's interesting because these words, Mina, Tekel, Parson, are words of measurement. It would be almost like if we saw on the wall something like gram, kilogram, ton. They're words of measurement. Daniel said, God has numbered your days, and you're done. God has weighed you on the balances, you don't measure up. Your kingdom has been divided, and now the Medes and the Persians are going to get it. Because Belshazzar refused to learn from the example of God's judgment on Nebuchadnezzar, he loses his kingdom. Nebuchadnezzar learned, Belshazzar had not. Then at Belshazzar's command, Daniel was dressed in purple robes, a gold chain was hung around his neck, and he was proclaimed the third highest ruler in the kingdom. Okay, we have to give Belshazzar credit for keeping his word. But he is foolhardy if he thinks this will postpone God's judgment by treating God's messenger well. So then verse 30, we go on. That very night, Belshazzar, the Babylonian king, was killed. And Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. So this is the end of Babylon. because Belshazzar confused his own power with God's power, his kingdom was lost. The fall of Babylon is well documented. It fell without a battle. And so, once again, we see how God controls history. We see what happens when the kingdom of God and the kingdom of man are fighting. Simple. God wins. So what are some lessons we can take away from this story in Daniel 5? First of all, I think we can see there's a warning to those in authority to seek humility and set aside pride. If we recognize God is in charge of the world, we need to honor him and not assume that we have arrived somewhere and we can continue on without God. Do we think we can get along okay without God? You notice Daniel didn't judge Belshazzar. He only interpreted God's judgment. A lot of our job is to offer life, hope, repentance, restoration, not to judge. We need to keep that in mind. I want to talk a little bit more about blasphemy. Blasphemy is a misuse of God's creation, of God's name. We don't have any holy temple vessels today as believers. We don't have a temple. We don't have these rituals that were consecrated by priests. You remember when Jesus was crucified, that veil separating the holy from the Holy of Holies in the temple was torn apart, indicating that separation was ended. Today, in a way, everything is holy. We can meet God anywhere. We can meet him in church. We can meet him on the street, at home, in a bar, at a baseball game. We can meet God everywhere. So some ways that we can commit blasphemy, even if we never take the name of the Lord in vain. That's kind of the classic blasphemous. No, but we as believers, we can insult God when we assault a fellow human being. I don't mean physically punch him in the face or something, but I do mean speak harshly to them or about them, not help them. They are created in the image of God as well. So we need to be aware of all people and honor all people. In the same vein, we need to honor fellow believers. Make sure that we don't have angry words, we don't have gossip, those undermining, undercutting, stabbing in the back, certainly not with another believer. We are in the family of God. We are the temple of the Holy Spirit. So we need to honor other believers. And we also need to honor God's creation. And I'm even talking about mountains and rivers and streams in the sky. We need to take care of those things as well. That's part of our calling. And another lesson that we can learn from this story is to learn from the past. Belshazzar did not do that. He did not learn from the past, and he was doomed because of that. Belshazzar thumbed his nose at Nebuchadnezzar's accomplishments, and we know how that came out. So some things that we can learn, as I said. Seek humility. We can't go on without God. Don't judge others. Our job is to offer words of life, not condemnation. Do not accept blasphemy in your own life. If you see ways that you are not honoring other humans created in God's image, not honoring believers who are the temple of the Holy Spirit, not honoring God's creation, you need to take that up with the Lord and begin to try and dig that out of our lives. And another thing is to learn from the past. We have the great honor to have the entire Bible here for us to learn from the past, to see how God has worked in different ways and what his principles are. Powerful opportunities for us as well. So, odd story to see the finger of God take down a king who thought he was powerful. But a story that certainly resonates with us today, as we sometimes think we are powerful, we are above certain things, we indulge ourselves, we do not remember the past. So that's today's lesson. Thank you for being here and joining me. Next time, we will take a look at Daniel 6. So have a great week. God bless.